Hello, welcome to the concept videos for Chapter 3. Please make sure that you look through the PowerPoint slides prior to viewing these videos, as I'm going to be going through some examples of the concepts that are covered in the PowerPoint slides. The first topic we're going to cover is overhead rates. In Chapter 3, we're discussing three different types of costing: job costing, operations costing, and process costing. Job costing is similar to what we learned about in Chapter 2. We learn about how to allocate direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. Overhead can be driven by various cost drivers. This can be referred to as the cost driver or the allocation base. These terms are used interchangeably. When we're looking at an overhead rate, the best way to do this is to come up with estimates. We're going to estimate our total manufacturing overhead costs, and when we divide that by our estimated cost driver in terms of units, then we come up with a overhead rate. Let's look at an example. So this month we have various overhead costs that are made up of depreciation, rent, utilities, and other overhead costs. This makes up our total manufacturing overhead of 8,000 hours. This company has determined that they're going to use labor hours as their allocation base or cost driver. How do we calculate the overhead rate per direct labor hour? Well, we're going to simply take the total overhead costs divided by the hours for that month, giving us a rate of $10 per direct labor hour. This is the plant-wide overhead allocation rate. Okay? Now, same example, this is a pizza company. They make three different types of pizza. They have thick crust, thin crust, and deep dish. If they want to come up with allocation rates based on the different type of pizza as opposed to a plant-wide allocation rate, they would have to look at the amount of labor hours that are spent on each type of pizza. So this is in minutes, so we're going to have to translate that over into hours. So 10 divided by 60 is 0.16 hours. 6 divided by 60 is 0.1 hours. And 15 divided by 60 is 0.25 hours. So this is hours. Okay? We're going to simply do the same thing again. The allocation of overhead for each type of pizza. Okay? If we were looking at $8,000, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the overhead cost. So we're looking at the number of hours, and the allocation rate is $10 per hour. So for thick crust pizza, they're going to get $10 times 7.17 hours. Okay? So it's going to be $1.67 for every pizza that they make. $10 times 0.10 hours is going to be $1 for every pizza they make. And deep dish is $10 times 0.25 hours, or $2.50 for each pizza that they make. Once we know the number of pizzas, we can use that allocation rate of overhead to calculate the total overhead cost for each type of pizza. So we were just talking about how the overhead rate is calculated, which is the total overhead divided by the total units. When we're not sure, or we don't already have the actual amounts, we are going to come up with a predetermined overhead rate based on the estimated overhead costs divided by the estimated units. This is a predetermined overhead rate that's going to be used throughout the period to allocate the overhead costs that should be expensed during the period. Typically, the predetermined overhead rate is calculated at the beginning of the period and used on an annual basis, but it could be monthly, quarterly, annually. In this example, we're budgeting $100,000 in overhead costs, and we're budgeting 8,000 labor hours. Therefore, our predetermined overhead rate is going to be $100,000 divided by 8,000 hours, or $12.50 per direct labor hour. So what is over and underapplied overhead, and why does it occur? Well, as I just mentioned, this is based on estimates. During the period, actual labor hours and actual overhead are going to be incurred. Overhead is applied or expensed to the inventory accounts based on the estimated overhead rate times actual hours incurred. Therefore, if we had actual hours of $8,100 hours, and we use our predetermined overhead rate of $12.50, that's our predetermined rate, then our applied overhead, that means what we expense during the period to our inventory accounts, is going to be $101,250. Now assume that the actual overhead costs were $102,000. What does this mean? Well, the actual overhead is based on the actual bills or expenses that were incurred for all of your overhead costs. And you're going to compare that, $102,000, to what was applied or expensed to the inventory accounts. In this case, the $101,250 is less than the actual. That means that overhead was under-applied by $750. When applied overhead is higher than your actual, then you would have over-applied overhead. So here we know that overhead was underapplied and understated by $750. What impact does this have on the cost of the product being produced? Well, it means that the overhead that we booked to the work in process and then finished goods and then cost of goods sold was ultimately $750 lower than what it should have been. So in this case, it would be a debit to cost of goods sold and a credit to your manufacturing overhead account. That way you would increase the expense for cost of goods sold, and this is for $750, to get the expense to where it should be. Okay? So there's three different types of overhead that we're talking about: predetermined, applied, and actual. Actual overhead is not a calculation. It is what is actually incurred based on bills/costs. Predetermined is estimated costs divided by estimated units or activity for the cost driver. And your applied overhead is equal to your predetermined rate, overhead rate, times your actual cost driver units. Okay? I'm going to stop here and do a separate video to talk about equivalent units. Thank you.